iRacing has undergone a significant transformation in community as well as product in the decade and a half since it's been launched. And especially over the past decade, iRacing has experienced a tremendous amount of growth, which left two distinct communities coexisting on the same service. I will affectionately call them the racers and the gamers. So today, I want to talk about how iRacing has historically kept these two sides existing on the same platform at the same time, along with some of the differences that each of these communities have, which are irreconcilable with each other. And finally, I want to explore how we move forward. How do we keep both these sides happy? Do we need to keep both sides happy? And what is the best for the future of iRacing as a service? First, let's start from the beginning. iRacing was launched in August of 2008 out of the ashes of Papyrus Racing and backed by billionaire John Henry. Now, if the name John Henry sounds familiar to you, it's probably because he owns both the Red Sox and Liverpool FC and is also a partial owner of Roush Fenway Keselowski Racing. But regardless of who owned the company and who was developing the game, if you were to choose a year to release your subscription-based, very expensive, hyper-realistic simulation game, I don't think 2008 would be that year. And not only that, but initial pricing for iRacing was more expensive than it is in 2023. And that's not counting for inflation, it was purely more expensive. Instead of tracks being $12 or $15 depending on the size, in 2008, individual tracks were either $15 or $25. That is up to $35 in today's money for a single track on iRacing. On top of that, membership prices were even higher back in 2008 than they are now, with the cheapest level of subscription being the 1-year level at $13 a month. Now that came with a $60 iRacing credit, but regardless, you had to spend $156 to be on iRacing for a full year. That is a staggering $223 in today's money to be on iRacing for a single year in 2008. The reason I bring this up is because we have to think about what type of community emerges out of these conditions, especially in the year 2008, where a much smaller percentage of people had the disposable income to not only pay for these iRacing prices, but buy any sort of sim racing gear as a whole. So using those ideas and information, we can make some inferences about the early iRacing community and of course confirm them with people who were actually part of it in 2008-2009 era. So especially compared to 2023, iRacing in 2008 was a lot older in terms of age, was also a lot more wealthy in terms of who would have access to the game in the first place, and also a lot more ingrained with the racing community because those would be the people who would be dedicated enough to spend that much money on a product in that time. And also because of the regional pricing being even that much more insane in 2008, iRacing was a lot more American than it is now. And this is where we get the first community coming out of iRacing that would grow over time. It's not exclusively with people who've been on iRacing since 2008, but this community of people take iRacing extremely seriously as if it was real life. And I'm not saying that's the right way or the wrong way to approach iRacing. I am just stating a fact on that's who they are. And that is the way that iRacing wanted it to be and probably still wants it to be to this day. Now, the reason that everything was so expensive back then was not necessarily just because iRacing wanted to line their pockets. They were backed by a billionaire. And when you're backed by a billionaire, being that small of a company with that little of reach overall, that kind of screams to me that this was a passion project. I don't want to make this sound like a fact, this is just my opinion, but I believe that iRacing was created with the intention to gatekeep everybody except for the very dedicated racers so that they could all enjoy racing with each other online. I mean, they obviously probably knew that they had to turn a profit eventually, but I don't think they were rushing into it. But iRacing wasn't some smash hit off the bat. It's pretty easy to see how many iRacers there were back in 2008 because every custom member ID is chronological, so you can see that about 25,000 accounts were made in the year 2008, and probably a majority of those even were not active members at the time, only buying the 1 or 3 month upon release. So I think it'd be a pretty decent logical leap to assume that there were about 10,000 active iRacers in those early days, especially after the first month when a lot of those people tried and then didn't come back. What was left out of that community was extremely tight-knit, very dedicated, and everybody knew each other, which is very different to what you see today. So what changed between the year 2008 and the year 2023 that we saw a completely new type of community emerge out of iRacing? Well, it's more about what didn't change with iRacing and what changed with the rest of the world. Back in 2008, paying $100 per year plus just to have to buy DLC also for the game was probably one of the most ridiculous pricing structures that you could ever imagine. But as the years went on and we got into the mid 2010s and up until 2020, this became more and more normal. Like for instance, with Madden, you pay $60 a year for the video game, and then just to play a mode where you have to buy a bunch of packs, probably hundreds of dollars worth, just to have a competitive team. This behavior with games became normalized, and suddenly the pricing structure that iRacing may or may not have used to gatekeep other users became something that people were willing to do to try out iRacing. Along with that, more people had disposable income to purchase sim racing gear and not feel too bad about purchasing those DLC tracks and cars for iRacing. So really around 2015, maybe a little earlier, is where you see the new wave of gamers enter the sphere of iRacing. The gamers who were coming into iRacing were both a lot younger and a lot more willing to treat iRacing like a video game. This led to a lot of interesting things. Now, at first, the kids who entered iRacing were just kind of considered squeakers, and they really did integrate quite well into the community as they were surrounded by a bunch of the old community who still had their ideals and were kind of enforcing it on the track and off the track. But as the years ticked on, the number of iRacing racers who had never been involved with any sort of racing in real life and just liked racing video games rose and rose until one big event turned everything on its head, and of course, I am referring to 2020. With everybody staying at home and some extra money from certain places that they didn't know what to do with, iRacing exploded in popularity. And with the rise in popularity, of course, the majority of the type of person joining this would be the gamer. Because suddenly iRacing was just any other expensive video game. It wasn't some unobtainable service only for the elites anymore. And honestly, at this point, I see a lot of similarities to the classic Tetris community. I enjoyed watching those videos, and I still watch the championships, but you used to see a bunch of older guys reliving their favorite game as a kid. Boom, Tetris for Jonas, boom, Tetris for Jeff, those type of things. Well, after the game got popular, it got completely taken over by kids with a lot of free time. Not necessarily from the entire community standpoint, but especially from the competitive standpoint. But of course, there are some issues that come with the split in the mentality of the community. The people who identify with real racing, who want to be as immersed as possible, can really get upset at the gamers for racing in a certain way that is not realistic or would be very frowned upon in real life. Whereas the gamers a lot of the time can feel very restricted by what iRacing enforces and doesn't enforce in their rules, to where other video games might be a lot more lenient on certain things, but iRacing is very strict because of their legacy of being very by the book. We want this to be like real racing experience. This mentality is very clear, especially reading my YouTube Shorts comments of all things, because those shorts reach an audience that don't really interact or race iRacing ever. So to see their reaction on some of the inner workings of the rules and how you're supposed to race, where they are just really experienced with other racing video games, it really does show the disconnect that can happen when those people will eventually try iRacing and become part of the community. But I don't think the solution is to necessarily meet in the middle between the racers and the gamers. I really think that iRacing has a special place because of what they enforce to be realistic. I don't think they do a perfect job at it, and hopefully their new protest system does a better job of really being clear and objective with what is and isn't allowed. I think one of the growing pains that iRacing has gone through as they've grown is the protest system has been built for that small community. If somebody does something wrong, you look at it subjectively and say, hey, you can do this better next time, but we're all racing together, we're all here to have fun. As iRacing has grown, it has become a lot more need for this objective, this is what happened, this is what we'll do to you, and hopefully that new protest system will enforce something like that. As for more of the it's a sim type of community, I think that just understanding that needing to compete at the high levels, you have to exploit some of those things that make iRacing a game. That's just a necessity. That's always going to happen in any sort of not real life computer simulation, any sort of video game. whether it be iRacing, Assetto Corsa, R-Factor, any of them. There's always going to be something that doesn't seem realistic that gets you speed at the end of the day. And the only thing you can do is take it for what it is and race with it and get the advantage, or race without it and know that you're going to be at a disadvantage. And of course, it's easy to say iRacing fix your game at that point, but there's just so much of that stuff. It's just like playing whack-a-mole. I can't blame iRacing too much for not having the perfect real-life situation with no minor exploits or dumb things that get speed. It's just always going to happen. But overall, my hope is that as iRacing grows and includes more and more of the mainstream gaming community, that community would be open to accept at least some of the simulation and immersion ideals that the original community really held. I've said for a long time, iRacing as a service has some value, but the greatest amount of value that a sim racing service can have is connecting people who want to race well, cleanly, and hard against each other. Thank you all for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you all on the track.